My name is Roopa Foley. I am the Global Co-Head of Financial Services for Egon Zehnder. Together with my co-head, Lula, we lead all of the financial services practice for our firm, Egon Zehnder, globally.
So the focus of this story is around innovation and how banks are making sure that they're staying up to date. What are you seeing in terms of looking at the market when it comes to gaps between what banks and financial services are doing, or maybe even fintechs are doing, and the kinds of talent that they're looking for to fill those gaps?
Yeah. So what we're seeing in the market in terms of gaps and what companies are doing to fill the gap is really centered around innovation. The pace of innovation is faster than what we've ever seen, both on the fintech side as well as the financial services side. We've seen firsthand that there's a growing need for professionals who have both financial services and technology skills, because the innovation is really driven by technology. There's three key areas where we've seen that demand significantly increase. One is around data and analytics, data science, and AI being embedded into data science and analytics. Two is cybersecurity. The threats are ever increasing, especially for financial services organizations. But the one I'd really like to touch on is the intersection of technology and compliance. We have seen a surge in interest by financial services institutions, both traditional banks and fintech players, as well as, frankly, insurance companies and asset managers in the risk, regulatory, and compliance field, and not only at the executive level, but also at the board level. The ability to respond to regulators, partner with regulators, and use technology to respond quickly has become increasingly important.
So you've been doing this for some time now. But if you were to look back, let's say 5 years ago, and look at the shifts and changes you've seen over that time, what are the bigger differences between 5 years ago and now in this sector?
Yeah, so what I would say is companies are thinking differently. I think about talent, and I think, again, technology plays a role in that. The fintech landscape has kind of transformed the way traditional players have had to think about the way they do business with the same customers. So one of the big shifts we've seen in the past 5 years is the importance of technology understanding and technology savviness. And so really, even in a traditional organization, understanding how technology may play a role or play a part, either in cost reduction, in revenue increasing, or even in the competitive landscape, becomes increasingly important. The other thing we've seen over the 5 years change is something we've really focused on as important for quite some time, and it's less about the what and more about the how. And so even private equity companies, what we're seeing is they're caring more about how leaders lead, as opposed to them just having checked the boxes on the things that they've done. Because what companies are realizing is that if you don't have the soft skills, it can overshadow the technical skills that are required for a particular role, whether it's at the CEO level or further down. The last thing I will say that's changed is for banks. I think 5 years ago, we probably saw less hiring from the outside. There was a lot of kind of moving up within the organization, and we continue to see that. But some organizations have now realized the importance of bringing outside talent in. And what that does is it brings different perspectives, it brings different ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, and helps with that innovative theme that we talked about before.
That's interesting what you said about soft skills. How is that assessed? How do you judge that? I mean, I think you can talk about numbers and deliverables, but maybe this is a little bit more abstract too. You can't interview everyone that's ever worked for them. How do you go about that?
We go about that a few ways. So we start with understanding what soft skills are important to each client that we partner with. We'll spend time with the company, meeting their leaders, showing up at their office, seeing how the receptionist greets us, and seeing what kind of cultural values are important to a company. and we incorporate that into what we look for. We gain alignment with our client in terms of what's really important to them. And then we do behavioral interviews to really understand, you increased revenue threefold. How did you do that? What were the things that led you to be able to increase that revenue? We're less worried about the fact that you increased the revenue. We're more curious about how you leveraged your team. What outside information did you include? How curious were you about what your competitors were doing? And so we try to understand the how of the way the person got there. We also assess for important skills, and so some of the things that we're seeing are increasingly important for banks. Of course, driving results is always there, and I think I would say most bankers are really good at driving results. But it's around collaboration and influencing. How do you bring people along on the journey? How do you drive change leadership? How do you get followership for your ideas so that it's not just a body of one trying to make change happen, but you've got the entire team of thousands behind you? And then we also look for 4 different potential areas that demonstrate for us that the soft skills are there. And those are curiosity, which is curiosity about yourself. Are you willing to change? Are you willing to improve? Are you willing to receive feedback that will make you even better? Insight, which is around how do you process data and solve problems. Engagement, which is the heart. How do you gain followership by really understanding people on a human level? And determination, which is really back to the result driving, which is, really having determination and resilience.
Interesting. So you are kind of in a unique position that you obviously get to meet the client as they're maybe even ideating what their gaps are and what their needs are and helping them develop briefs, I assume, and all the way through to who actually gets the job offer in the end, who actually starts working there. Do you see any discrepancies or trends between what the banks think they want and who they actually end up with during your process or going through this search?
It's a really good question. So I would say we do sometimes see a mismatch, and I'd like to talk about 2 different mismatches. So at times, it's a mismatch between what the client wants and what they end up getting, but sometimes it's a mismatch between what the client thinks they want and what they need. And so the way we kind of get at both of those mismatches is to align up front and ensure that everyone is on the same page with respect to what they're looking for. And through that alignment, we do one-on-one interviews. We talk to everybody. We say, here's where you're aligned. Here's where you're not aligned. And what that does is it takes some of the guessing out of the process for us. We then clearly have a conversation on, here's where you're not aligned. Stakeholder 1 wants someone who's super tech savvy and may even be an engineer. Stakeholder 2 wants a pure banker that has only done banking. Which is it? And why? And so unless we gain alignment on the spec, it becomes very difficult for us to solve a search. And so what that does is it ensures that a mismatch is less likely. So that's one type of mismatch. The other mismatch is, I think sometimes clients go into the market thinking they want something different, but then realize that in fact what they want is what they've had before. So it's the appreciation for wanting something different and having the risk, I call it soft risk appetite, of taking someone that's a little different from what you've had, that at times our clients have to reconcile with. So I'll give you an example. There was a client we had that came to us and said, we're looking for our next CEO. We don't even want to look at banking. Let's look at Twitter. Let's look at Netflix. Let's look at pure tech companies for our next leader, despite the fact they were a highly regulated financial services institution. And so what we did instead is we aligned with the stakeholders, and we brought what I would call a rainbow of colors. We brought people from pure tech companies, we brought people from fintech companies, and we brought pure bankers. And what we did is as they met this wide range of people, they were able to calibrate and understand what actually would work or wouldn't. And where we ended up in that case is with a fintech executive. So brought a little bit of the tech and a lot of the banking, partnership with the regulators, and that ended up being the solution in that instance.
That makes sense. So, specifically thinking about the most urgent needs at the moment for financial institutions, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but which departments or which functions or which roles are kind of most in demand? Or maybe even where are banks hesitant to bring in new talent from the outside?
So in terms of the areas that we have seen in highest demand, I referenced it before a little bit, it's around the risk and regulatory space. Organizations are more and more trying to embed all of the risk and regulatory requirements in the front of their process, where traditionally it was at the end of the process. It was, let's run this customer through all of these things, and then at the end, let's double check that that they haven't done X, Y, and Z. Now what companies are trying to do is feather that into the technology and embed it into the process, which when you're working off of legacy systems becomes a lot more difficult than if you are a fresh new company that can embed it into the technology right at the start. So we're seeing a lot of interest in having more tech-savvy risk, regulatory, and compliance leaders. So that's one. AI has been coming up as quite an interesting area for many of our clients. And it feathers in together a little bit with the risk and regulatory and compliance piece, because you're starting to see head of AI and risk and compliance. You're also starting to see chief AI officers, and the question is still out there about where does it sit? Does it report to the CEO? AI and data and analytics is becoming more important as people are thinking about customer experience and how do we delight our customers. Governance is actually thinking about how do we use AI for some of our governance work. So the AI area is still blossoming, but we're seeing really escalating demand and interest from our clients in learning more about it, again, both at the board and the executive level.
And like also following up on something you've talked about, the technology skills versus maybe traditional leadership skills. How do financial institutions or fintechs decide which leg to stand on? Can you ask for both? And there's lots of people like that, or are there compromises? And how do they think around cutting, maybe not cutting corners, but limiting their rainbow that they're looking for to something that's more feasible or achievable?
Yeah, it's a really good question on how do you what are the gives and the takes. I think anyone you ask in our profession is going to say the purple unicorn does not exist. So there are gives and takes in just about every situation, and the trade-offs are always there. I think what's most important is understanding what we would call the must-haves. What are the things the candidate must have and must demonstrate? So, for example, we were recently doing a CEO search for a bank, and the mandate there was to continue the legacy of the former CEO. So ideally in that situation, you would prefer to have someone from inside be promoted, but in this instance, that was not an option. And so to look outside, some of the cultural aspects were really heavily important in terms of how this organization was run, behaviors that were just considered, really important to this organization. Understanding that the new CEO would come and meet every employee at some point was really important to the board. In another instance, transformation was hugely important to the organization. And so the cultural aspects took a little bit more of a backseat, because when you're doing a massive transformation, the culture will likely also change. So I think in each of these cases, it really just depends on what the most important things are, and really weighing heavily on those areas and then using the other areas as trade-off.
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about the employer's perspective. So switching tack a little bit, thinking about the candidates, who or what kind of person or profile coming from a tech organization do you think will be the most successful to drive innovation within a more slow-moving, regulated, traditional financial institution?
Yeah. So in terms of having people in a more regulated, slower moving institution, what we see is that, first of all, the culture fit is super important. Really, and when I say culture fit, I'm not saying it has to be exactly the same. I think it's really around understanding what is going to work within the culture and making sure that you have the ability to gain followership. So really, I guess change management becomes important. Communication. Effective leaders have to communicate. I often like to say that in the absence of communication, people make up their own stories. So a good leader is constantly communicating with the team and explaining what's happening and what's going on and why things are, what changes are taking place. Another skill that we've seen become increasingly important is adaptability and being agile. So really understanding that the unexpected will most certainly happen. And there's several unexpected things that we can all point to that have happened over the course of the past 5 years. But really being comfortable in the ambiguity, being able to pivot the strategy, while at the same time maintaining compliance with the regulators becomes increasingly important. And then we talked already about having a vision, especially and so having a vision, having a strategy, having a perspective, knowing where you're headed becomes important as well. And so what I would say to your question is these are all true whether someone comes out of technology or doesn't. So just because you come out of technology, you don't get a pass on some of the important soft skills that are going to be required in order to be an effective and impactful leader.
Roopa, thank you very much for that insight. Really appreciate that, and look forward to seeing what's around the corner in this space.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited, and hope you have a nice day.